Okay. All right, so welcome this evening to this talk. My name's Judith Hamilton. I'm a lecturer at the University of Wolverhampton, and I lecture in linguistics and TESOL as well. I'm not a speech and language therapist, I'm not a speech and language specialist, but as part of what we teach at the university, we look at child language acquisition, we look at some of the practical aspects and some of the stages that children go through, but we look at the different theories that people have come up with over the years. So that's what we're going to be having a look at this evening. So what I'm aiming to do is to talk for about 45, I think about 50 minutes, and then if you've got questions, I can answer those at the end. So really, when we think about acquiring our mother tongue, would be one word for it. You'll also see on the slides I talk about L1 as first language. There have been sort of three main theories that have been suggested so far. And then in the last 20 years there's been something else. So the first one is to do with imitation. So do children simply imitate what they hear around them? The second idea is that language acquisition is innate, that there's something in the human brain that makes it unavoidable almost to learn language. As a sort of subsidiary to that, people have become very interested in interaction. What is the role of interacting with other people, with your environment when you're acquiring language? And then finally, people have come up with more about using language, theories about using language in the last 20 years or so. So this belongs to a field of what we call developmental psycholinguistics, and which is all about the study of how children acquire their first language. It can also be about how they acquire another language. What we tend to assume, I think, is that the majority of children in the world are born monolingual, which is not the case. But most of the research that has been done in psycholinguistics has not only been done on children acquiring English, it's been done on monolingual children. So there are some people who argue that this is a bit skewed. It's also about discovering the biological and social processes that make language development possible. Now, one thing about language acquisition, LA, is that it's universal. It happens across the world's languages, and no matter what language you look at, there are similarities in how children acquire language. And what we can say with some confidence, I think, hopefully you will feel this way, is that you know your L1, you know your mother tongue. In contrast to perhaps any L2 or second language or another language that you might speak, where there tends to be quite a lot more variability. And also, children are able to use most syntactic patterns and grammar. So really, that children are familiar with grammatical rules before they reach school age. So by the time they go to school, in the case of English, passives, there's still some acquisition going on, but most of the grammar that they need is there by the time they go to school. So I'm going to run through very quickly the kind of different stages that children go through as they acquire language, and then talk about the different theories. So this bit will be quite quick because I'll just get through this. So language learning actually starts before a baby is born. babies in utero can hear as early as 16 weeks, and I think in the past, it was certainly when I was expecting, it was all about playing Mozart to your baby and things like that, but it doesn't really work like that. But what children can do is they can pick up the rhythm, the intonation, patterns, they pick those up from their mother's voice. And very shortly after birth, the first 6 months or so, children can hear phonetic differences. So they can hear differences in sounds that possibly we don't hear, because we only tend to hear the differences in sound that affect meaning. So there's some really interesting research that was done by Patricia Kuhl, working with Japanese babies. So obviously in English, L and R are different sounds for us, but in Japanese, they aren't different sounds. They don't change meaning. So Japanese does actually have a L and a R sound. It just doesn't affect meaning. So after a while, from about 6 months on, Japanese babies lose that ability to hear that distinction because they don't need to hear it. Babies in bilingual environments retain that ability for longer. So children who are spoken to with a little bit of Japanese, mostly English, they do retain that ability. Okay, so I think we probably know the first milestone, which is crying, and which is when children are first born. Then between about 6 to 8 weeks, we have cooing noises, which is another milestone, and then babbling at about 6 to 8 months old. And these tend to be consonant vowel sounds, so you get ba, 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 da, da, da. So you've got a consonant followed by a vowel sound. And this is true across languages. So I've got a nice clip here that I will show you, which is of, this is a deaf baby who is babbling. And you can really see in this clip that this child is babbling. They are attempting to communicate. So you can see it's waving, it's making some gestures. Oh, banana's more interesting. So the baby is deaf, but you can see they're really trying to start using. So this does seem to be something that occurs across all languages, so even sign languages, including sign languages. From 12 to 18 months, we have the holophrastic stage, which holo means whole, phrastic, phrase, and this is where one word has lots of different meanings. So you get a child might say gone, dada, teddy. Teddy could be, oh, there's my teddy, I want my teddy, my teddy's over there, look, my teddy's dressed up in a nice hat or something. So one word can have lots of different meanings. And then from about 2 years onwards, we have what's known as telegraphic speech. And if you're familiar with working with small children, or you're used to small children, you'll know that from about 2 years onwards, they go from having a vocabulary of about 50 words to suddenly exploding with their language. So they go from being able to make 2-word sentences like mummy play, up to, you know, getting longer and longer and longer. And probably from about 2 years onwards, the number of words that a child knows becomes less important than the what's known as the mean length of utterance. So how many words there are, or how many morphemes there are in the utterances that they make. And then finally, about 3.5 to 4 years, children are filling in those missing grammatical elements. They're starting to ask questions. And also, this is the age that we see children starting to adapt their own speech to babies. So they demonstrate they are able to change their speech depending on who they're speaking to, which again is quite a skill in its own right. So I thought I'd just finish off this section with a slide on what's known as child-directed speech. It's also known motherese, but it's not just mothers who use it. Then it was called caretaker language, but it's not just people who look after children who use it. I mean, people use it to talk to their pets as well, don't they? It's not just child-directed. But the characteristics of child-directed speech that have been observed, and this is only in some communities. So some communities just don't think that children aren't worth talking to. So they don't use child-directed speech, because what's the point? You can't have a conversation with a child. But where cultures that do have child-directed speech tend to have a slower rate of delivery, higher pitch, more varied intonation, shorter, simpler sentence patterns, frequent repetition and paraphrase, and also the topics change. So you're going to talk about topics that are related to a child's experience. Okay, so that's a very quick whiz through the different stages that children go through. Let's have a look at how children learn to speak. And what I've done is I've tried to include some of the sort of historical, not studies, possibly experiments, but I've tried to draw on children who have been used as illustrations over the years. Now, hopefully from this you can see that people have been interested in language for millennia, and this is Psamtik I, an Egyptian pharaoh in the 7th century BCE, and he wasn't so interested in language acquisition. What he was interested in was what was the most ancient language in the world. So what he did was he took 2 children and he gave them to some shepherds to look after. The shepherds weren't allowed to talk to the children, and the idea was that these children would, the words that these children emerged with would give some indication as to the most ancient language. After 2 years, one of the children uttered the word bekhoz, which is bread, or an approximation of bread in the Phrygian language. Just pure fluke. I mean, probably it sounded like the baaing of a sheep, I don't know. But that led the pharaoh to conclude that this was the most ancient language. So that's an example of where children have been used quite... that's the only thing we know. We don't know whether these children... I'm assuming these children probably never learned to speak properly. Yeah, that's all we know about that particular experiment. There is a sort of fascination slightly about what are called feral children in some of the studies of language acquisition. I feel a bit uncomfortable about it, but I've included a couple here simply because they are quite interesting, and I said I was looking at the history. So we then leap forward to approximately 1788. It was about 13 when he was found, so sort of 1790-ish. And this was Victor of Aveyron in France. And he was discovered in the woods, and they managed to capture him. He then ran away again, they caught him again. I think he ran away quite a few times. And eventually he was adopted by Jean-Marc Itard, a medical student, who he believed that language and empathy were what separated humans from animals. And at the time, we've got the age of the Enlightenment, we've got Rousseau's ideas of nobles, savages, and all this sort of thing. And it was thought of the time that if you introduced Victor into the streets of Paris and Parisian society, he would suddenly kind of be overwhelmed by the magnificent superiority of the culture. That didn't happen. He never really learnt to speak. And probably what had happened was that when he was found, he was covered in little scars. So it was probably the case that his parents abandoned him, and it was because he was autistic. That's the current theory. But he never acquired language. And I think he managed to do some signing. He managed to do some sign language, but that was about it. And there were a few other children at this time. There was Peter as well, in Germany. Okay, we're leaping forward to Skinner, who I think this is when the study of language acquisition starts to get more serious, if you like. And this is B.F. Skinner, who published Verbal Behaviour in 1957. And what he believed is that language is habit formation. So the way we learn to speak is all about learning habits. And we either learn good habits and we learn to speak well, or we learn poor habits and we don't learn to speak properly. For him, there wasn't anything innate about language acquisition. And as Aitchison says, all that's necessary is the systematic observation of the events in the external world which prompt the speaker to utter sounds. So what he did was he was a behaviourist. So he believed that you could train children to speak, essentially. And his work was initially based in rats. So if you've heard of Pavlov's dog, it was very similar to that. He managed to train rats to go through a maze, to then open a door to get some food. And he argued that the same happened when children were learning language. There was a stimulus. For example, the child sees an ice cream. If they say, ice cream, that's their response. They then get the ice cream, and so that is the reinforcement. So it's a kind of cyclical thing that if they don't say ice cream, or they say something different from ice cream, they're not going to get the ice cream that they want. Similarly, parent says dog, the child repeats the word dog, they get a well done and a smile, then that's the reinforcement. So this is very much about language as imitation, and children try and understand the meanings of sentences from the situation, and then they develop them by analogy. So give me the doll, give me the ball. They then work out what these different phrases mean. So here are some examples. This is from real data. So both children are about 24 months old, about 2 years. And you can see here that the mum says, "Shall we play with dolls?" Lucy replies, "Play with dolls." So that seems to indicate that perhaps there is some imitation going on. And I think children do imitate, don't they? Nursery rhymes, there is quite a lot of imitation when children are learning to speak. And I'm using the word learning here. Peter does it a little bit more, but he's still doing this. There's still repetition there, isn't there? However, I think we're all familiar with this kind of situation. You try to correct a child. I putted the plates on the table. You mean I put the plates on the table? No, I putted them on all by myself. So the parent or the carer is correcting the grammar, and the child seems to be immune to these corrections. And again, there is a lot of data to suggest that that is the case as well. So these dialogues come from a book called How Languages Are Learned. And you know, I think this is such a sad conversation. The child says, "Nobody don't like me." And the mum just replies, "No, say nobody likes me." Nothing, not like, "Oh, don't be so silly, darling."
Is it an old book? Is it an old book?
No. This is just literally just to prove that children are immune to these kinds of corrections. So the child insists on saying, "Nobody don't like me," 8 times, and then the child, exasperated, "Oh, nobody don't likes me." So that's how it ends. And then one other spoon, Daddy. You mean you want the other spoon? Da 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 da. Yes, okay. So we've got evidence that children do imitate, but we've also got evidence that this kind of reinforcement, this kind of correction, doesn't seem to work, or at least not in these cases. There probably are times when it does work. So this was one of the main reasons that it's probably a big name that you might have heard in linguistics, Noam Chomsky. So Noam Chomsky came along in 1959, and he actually wrote a review of verbal behaviour. It wasn't based on any experiments. His ideas were simply an attempt to review Skinner's book, but he came up with this phrase, the logical problem of language acquisition. And he argued that really behaviourism wasn't enough it didn't explain language acquisition satisfactorily. And rather than calling it learning, as maybe Skinner would do, he called it acquisition. The idea being that there is something innate in the human brain. It has been called something akin to a black box, but I'm not sure Chomsky ever really phrased it like that. But what he argued is that input is needed to trigger language acquisition. So as long as a child has lots and lots of input, that's all they need to acquire the language. And the fundamental properties, which he called the universal grammar, these are hardwired in the infant brain, and as long as the child gets lots of input, they will work the rules out for themselves. And there's all sorts of complicated rules, so that if you've got your verb at the end of the sentence, then your adjectives are likely to be, and the child's brain will there's a whole sort of series of switches, and the child's brain will just kind of switch on and work it all out for itself. So, properties specific to individual languages need to be learned, but there are patterns. And one of Chomsky's main criticisms was that a situation can produce any number of responses. So if a man goes running past with a chicken, he could say, and says, "Oh, a chicken." It could mean lots of things, couldn't it? It could mean, there goes lunch, the chicken's escaped again, oh my goodness, I almost ran it over. There could be lots of different interpretations, and that's something that Skinner doesn't really allow for. Chomsky also argued that the language that children hear is really pretty rubbish. When we talk, in general, we have lots of false starts, lots of hesitations, we speak in incomplete sentences, we have slips of the tongue. They are just a normal part of conversation, and that's just how we talk. Plus, we have the child-directed language that we're using when we talk to children. So Chomsky argued that instead of hearing all this lovely input, children just receive fragments, especially if you're in a family situation, because that's where you tend to be, at your most informal, and you've got lots of shared references. So you're not going to say, look at that beautiful. You just go, oh, look. And he argued that parental corrections, as we've seen, are either non-existent or inconsistent. I didn't bother correcting my children because I'd read some Chomsky, and my kids speak all right. Okay. One of the experiments that is often done to demonstrate that Chomsky's ideas are valid is something called the WUG test. And this was invented by Jean Gleason in the late 60s. And she wanted to see whether children had this ability to work with words that they'd never seen before and apply the rules. And so she came up with this cute little character known as a WUG, and it has proven to be remarkably good and consistent at demonstrating that children do have this ability. So again, I've got another brief clip here from, it's only a minute long.
Okay. It's called the WUG test. Jean still uses the original code she designed half a century ago. They showed that even with nonsense words they've never heard before, children can use grammatical rules that they've somehow absorbed.
What are they? You tell me.
Wag.
Is that louder?
Wags.
Yeah, this is great. Good. Okay. This is a man who knows how to bing. He's binging. He did the same thing yesterday. What did he do yesterday? Yesterday he binged. Very nice. Here is a man who knows how to zib. So what is he doing is zibbing. Good. What would you call a man whose job is to zib? He has to do it every day. His job is to zib, so he's a zibber. Very, very, very good.
Okay, so what Chomsky would argue is that no one's taught this child that you put an S on the end of a word to make it plural. No one's taught this child that if you want to say a job, you put an ER on the end or you put an on the end. That child's worked it out for themselves, and they've just used the kind of universal grammar that's keyed into their mind in order to do this. So that seems to suggest that perhaps there is something in our brains that helps us to acquire language, helps us to acquire our first language. And Chomsky's ideas really took hold, and poor old Skinner got rather left behind. He started, the idea of repetition is starting to kind of come back in, but for many, many years, Skinner's ideas were just, quite heavily criticised. Something else that came out of this idea of innate language was something known as the critical period hypothesis, which was proposed by Eric Lenneberg in about 1967. And that is that there is a specific limited time period when you can acquire a language through this language acquisition device. So I think we all know, don't we, that trying to acquire, when you hear young children who seem to acquire another language really, really easily, they don't seem to have an accent or anything like that, but as soon as we try to learn another language, then it just becomes painful. And it's a similar kind of thing, but with the critical period hypothesis, it's primarily about first language acquisition. So the suggestion is that the different parts of the brain sort of become more fixed at puberty, so the different functions of the brain and brain lateralization, the idea that everything crosses over, comes fixed at puberty, and it's after this time that the brain starts to lose its plasticity. People tend not to call a critical period now, it tends to be called a sensitive period, and people might have different ages, so pronunciation has a certain cut-off point, syntax has a certain cut-off point, maybe vocabulary. We keep on learning new vocabulary, don't we, throughout our lives. But puberty does seem to be key here. So this brings me on to another child who was abused, really. Well, she was abused by her family. And this is somebody called Jeannie, who again is well known in the literature. Her real name is Susan Wiley, and it's quite how she was treated by the researchers who studied her is again problematic. But she was discovered at the age of 13. Her mother was partially blind, her father was emotionally unstable, and Susan had been locked in a room and tied to a chair. And she'd also, because her father was very sensitive to sounds, she'd also learned to suppress any sounds that she might make, which is a factor in her language acquisition. But people often use Jeannie as an example of there being a critical period when you can acquire language. So I've got a couple of slides sort of going into some of the detail about her language acquisition. Her first words were CV monosyllables, which is normal, as we've seen, for a baby learning language. After 8 months, she'd managed to produce 2-word utterances like more soup, yellow car, genie purse, want milk. So she's got to the level of about a 2-year-old. So she seemed to go through the stages that a younger child would go through. But she kind of then stopped. She did have a larger vocabulary than a comparative 2-year-old who has the similar syntactic ability or ability with grammar. Now, the difference between competence and performance. Competence is what you can understand, and most people's linguistic competence is better than their performance. Most of us can understand more complex language than we can produce. So her linguistic competence was on a par with a 2 or 2.5-year-old, but her performance was much poorer. But there are certain things that we need to take into consideration that perhaps weren't thought about so much, is that she couldn't chew solid food when she'd never been given solid food, she'd never learnt to chew solid food, and developing these muscles is so, and how to use your tongue actually is so important for the production of sounds. And she had also learnt to repress, so she'd never learnt to control her voice box either. She'd never learnt, the difference between whispering and shouting. So there were lots of other factors that perhaps weren't initially explored in the early 70s. Now, as I've said, people often talk about Susan or Jeannie in relation to the idea of a critical period. I think somebody like Jerome Bruner would argue that what was missing for Jeannie was interaction. So this sort of, from about the 70s onwards, Jerome Bruner became very interested in what we call sociocultural ideas. So he took the views of Vygotsky and Piaget, and he really stressed the importance of interaction for children to acquire language. He said if you sit a child in front of a TV, they're not going to learn language. They need to interact with somebody else in order to acquire language. And for him, the emphasis was on development and not the end state. So it was about the process rather than getting to a kind of final end state. See, someone's writing. So he argued that language develops as a result of internal characteristics of the child and their external environment. So this could be physical and social. So a child has to be able to distinguish colour, for example, in order to be able to, or has to learn, what we mean by orange. They have to learn that in order to be able to pick out the orange car, or to say they want the orange car, for example. And this is an example that's often used for the benefits and the importance of interaction. And this is a good news story. This is a nice story. So this was a piece of research that was done by Jacqueline Sachs in 1981. And there was a child called Jim. He was hearing, but his parents were both deaf. And on the advice of the healthcare professionals, he was advised not to learn sign language, but that he should watch TV. So, he was watching Sesame Street and whatever. But this obviously wasn't working, because at the age of 3 years and 9 months, he was well below the expected language ability for a child of his age. And so they put some intervention in place. I think he had a few sessions with a speech and language therapist. And by 4 years, 2 months, so, almost 6 months later, he was almost at the typical level for a child, what you would expect for a child of that age. A couple of years later, his younger brother comes along, Glenn. Glenn didn't have the same problems that Jim did, because he had Jim to talk to. He had Jim to interact with and to learn from. So this is a study that's often cited to emphasise how important it is to interact with other people around you, but also, more importantly, I think, to interact with, you have that knowledgeable other of Vygotsky. And, his parents weren't doing anything wrong. It was simply that they were just doing what they'd been advised to do, but it wasn't working. They were very loving parents. The thing about the interactionists is that they still believe that there's this kind of black box. They still believe that there's something in our brains that is specific to language acquisition. And while there are areas in our brain that are focused on language, so we've got the Wernicke's and Broca's areas, nobody's ever found a magic part of the brain that's just devoted to language acquisition. And so we come on to the last sort of set of theories that have come on in the last 20 years. Michael Tomasillo, he's one of the kind of leading researchers in this area, and he argues that we learn language by using it. So it's similar, we learn it through interaction. But the thing that's different is that language acquisition is based on the same cognitive mechanisms, the same processes that allow a child to learn lots of other things. So, for example, as a child develops that fine motor control in their fingers, they're also developing the motor control in their mouths as well, that will mean they're able to speak. There was the FOXP2 gene that was found a few years ago. It was a big thing about, is this the language gene? It wasn't really the language gene. It was the gene for being fine motor control. Although that does have a link with language acquisition. So what people argue in what's known as usage-based perspectives is that language acquisition is the result of exposure to language used in the environment. And the input, the frequency with which you get certain words is a powerful predictor of what you'll learn. And there are two, I'd just like to finish with two aspects that children do in lots of areas of life, but this is linked to language in particular. And this is pattern spotting, which is the first one, and then we'll have a look at intention reading. So in this idea of a usage-based interaction, children spot patterns. So they get the noise of language coming towards them, and they learn patterns rather than learning rules. So they learn, for example, that if you want to talk about more than one thing, the pattern is we put an S on the end. Not obvious, not always in English. But on the whole, children don't learn words directly, so they're not learning ball, cup, etc. They're learning to try and understood the things that are said to them. So if we take throw the ball, for example, they need to work out the pattern there, throw, and eventually they will learn out, okay, throw, that's an action, I need to do that action. The ball, that's the object. And they might hear ball in lots of other contexts. So they will probably hear, gimme the ball, that's my ball, the ball's in the bush. And then eventually they will use the word ball, and it could mean any of those things, couldn't it, as we've seen with that holophrastic stage that children go through. So I think we're good at spotting patterns, aren't we? Those faces that you get in, potato, and somebody goes, there's the face of Jesus in the potato. We are very good at trying to spot patterns in things, and we spot patterns in language as well. And the final one is intention reading, which is a really important pragmatic skill that we develop. And that's all about trying to manipulate the intentions or mental states of another person. And children can do this before they even talk by pointing. And I'm sure if you work with children, or you've got children of your own, that children are good at pointing at things and getting what they want, aren't they? Or drawing your attention to the objects that they want. So pointing is really important. I won't show you the clip. You know what pointing is. Okay, so just some final thoughts. Language acquisition begins long before children begin to speak, and there are certain bits of equipment now. There are little helmets that you can put on babies' heads to see what's going on inside children's brains. Then input from others seems to be essential, but so does interaction with others. And child-directed speech has a purpose. It helps children, it seems to help children identify those patterns in language that they need in order to acquire language. But finally, we've still got a lot to learn, I think, about child language acquisition. Just like our brains, we know so little about what really is going on in our brains. Okay, so you may be familiar with some of these already. There's a really interesting, big research project being run, partly by the University of Liverpool, called LUCID, which looks at language and communication development. The BBC Tiny Happy People has some videos with Professor Ben Ambridge, who talks about the importance of things like child-directed language and how a baby's attention is held far longer if you use that child-directed language you've got your, you can keep hold of the child's attention for longer. Patricia Cool, that's a really interesting TED talk. I'm sure you're familiar with TED talks. They're really good and very clear. And then finally Deb Roy, who, again, this sort of theories of language acquisition tie quite often in with technological developments. So Deb Roy was able to wire up his whole house. Every single room in his house had a video camera and microphones, and they captured the first, I think it must be at least the first 2 or 3 years of their son's life. These video cameras ran for about 10 hours a day and captured everything that went on at home. He was able to then trace him or his wife as they walked around the flat. They were able to trace the baby, where the baby was, and he even then traced the development of the word water from a kind of ga to water. So yeah, there's some really fascinating things that are going on. Okay. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you for coming along.